Cooper on the Case, a Masonic Authors Guild International production.
The Mystery of the French Theologian. Hello and welcome to this episode of Cooper on the Case, where I examine statements made by various authors about Freemasonry to test their accuracy and validity. In the last episode, I discussed a quote provided by Bajan and Lee in their book, The Temple and the Lodge, in Chapter 11 on page 228, and footnote 4 from the 1992 paperback Corgi edition. It was clear that the authors had misquoted A.E. Waite. Today I shall examine the three quotes on pages 229 to 230 and their footnotes 5 to 8, which are on pages 376 and 377. All of these are also from the 1992 Corgi edition. The first of these begins with, quote, in 1689 at the Battle of Killiecrankie, close quote, and it is from a question by B.W. Hextall on a paper called The Origin of Additional Degrees in the Annual Transactions of Quater Coronati Lodge 2076 in 1919 by J.E.S. Tuckett. The quote is not from the actual paper by Tuckett, despite Bajan and Lee stating that they were repeating Tuckett's words. The next quote begins, and the Lord of Mar was Grand Master, close quote, by John Yarker from his book Notes on the Scientific and Religious Mysteries of Antiquity, the Gnosis and Secret Schools of the Middle Ages, Modern Rosicrucians, and the Various Rites and Degrees of Free and Accepted Masonry in 1872. Phew, my goodness, they loved long titles back then. These two quotes are not exactly as given by the original authors, but are sufficiently accurate and, more or less, repeat Waite's earlier statement. They are mentioned here because they are needed to show the full sequence of Bajan and Lee's argument. It is the next, third reference that is the most important, and this is given in full. Quote, prior to Yarker, the story appeared in a booklet published in 1842. The author is anonymous, but may well have been the Scottish poet and academic W. E. Ayton. We find from the testimony of Abbe Calmet that he had received from David Graham, titular Viscount of Dundee, the Grand Cross of the Order, worn by his gallant and ill-fated brother at the Battle of Killiecrankie. Il était, says the Abbé, Grand Maitre de l'Ordre Templars en Écosse, close quote. As you will notice, my French pronunciation is probably somewhat suspect, but that is translated as it was the Grand Master of the Order of the Templars in Scotland. The footnote number 7 tells us that the booklet was the, quote, Statutes of the Religious and Military Order of the Temple, on page 15, and which contains a historical notice, in other words, the traditional history of the order. To describe this as a booklet is misleading, as this was the foundational document of this new Masonic order, which had been created by prominent Freemasons who were reorganizing numerous ceremonies that were unrelated to St. John's Masonry, that is, the 3 craft degrees which were under the jurisdiction of the Grand Lodge of Scotland. In fact, the historical notice contained within the statutes of 1843 explain why those who founded the order needed a new and different history, because, being a Scottish Masonic order, they could not tolerate the existing French version of the story of the Knights Templars. In other words, a fictional account of the Knights Templar was invented to replace the unacceptable French version. The footnotes provided by Bajan and Lee give the sources of their information. This allows the reader to backtrack the sources and come to a judgment as to whether or not they have been used correctly. It is significant that the authors missed the statement within the historical notice that Scottish Freemasons had invented this history for their own purposes, that is, a traditional history, a discussion of which will have to wait for another day. Although footnotes are important, as I've tried to explain in this podcast, they can serve another purpose, and that is what sources have not been used. Had the authors delved a little deeper, they would have discovered that the origin of the myth was to be found in a book with the title A Sketch of the History of the Knights Templar, written by James Burns, or Burness, 1801 to 1862, published in Edinburgh in 1837. This was written for, guess who? The Scottish Masonic Order of the Knights Templar. Burns was a distant relative of the poet Robert Burns, and had been commissioned by the order to prepare a history for their use. He makes no mention of Calmet. Who then was Calmet, and how does he come to be quoted in the historical notice of 1843, but not in Burns in 1837? As mentioned in the previous podcast, his full name, titles, and date of birth and death are the Right Reverend Abbot Dom Antoine Augustine Calmet, Order of St. Benedict, 1672 to 1757, Abbot of the Abbey of Senons. In the Temple and the Lodge, Bajan and Lee write a great deal about Calmet and his life and work. Calmet was a prodigious writer, but there is only one mention of any of his writings, and that is also in a footnote, number 8, and which reads, quote, Magillio, les mémoires sur la correspondance identi de Dom Calmet, close quote. This is a book by Louis Magillio, which examines previously unpublished letters of Calmet. But this book was not published until 1863, and so the Scottish Masonic Order of Knights Templar could not have drawn on that source during the period 1837 to 1843. In one sense, the footnote helps in that it allows us to know what the book was not used for. Conclusion. I have previously explained that my interest was in footnotes and how they are used by authors to support the points that they make in their books, etc., and this is true for this episode. Some might argue that statements made by others have been deliberately manipulated by Bajan and Lee to suit their arguments. This is especially true of those made by A.E. Waite, as explained in the earlier podcast. Footnotes are therefore important as they allow the reader, any reader, to check the sources used by the writer or writers. Even more importantly, they allow the reader to check that the author or authors have used the sources correctly. At least this investigation has identified the Dom Calmet used by the Scottish Masonic Order of Knights Templar, but not why. Unfortunately, the sources have not allowed me to answer that question. However, it is difficult to imagine that many people would take the time and trouble that this Magi has, and he has only examined 5 footnotes from one particular book. That then is the mystery of the French theologian Dom Augustine Calmet and the Scottish Knights Templars, a mystery that remains to be solved. I shall remain on the case until I find the lost case of whiskey. Tune into the next episode to check on my progress.
Cooper on the case. This podcast is for educational purposes and perhaps entertainment. While the Masonic Authors Guild International provides the most accurate information possible, listeners use the information at their own risk. This podcast and its contents are Magi's properties, as are all the opinions and information it presents. Robert L.D. Cooper, Mark A. Tabberson, any other speakers' views and opinions within the podcast do not represent nor speak for Freemasonry, any Masonic organization, their former or current employers in any way, shape, or form. Magi, Cooper, or Tabbert will not compensate you in any way whatsoever if you happen to ever suffer an inconvenience due to the information herein contained.